If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Hi, everybody. This is Jason Rosenbaum, a political correspondent with St. Louis Public Radio and one of the hosts of Politically Speaking. What you're about to hear is a conversation I had with Carla Power, a St. Louis native and author of the brand new book, Homeland Security. It's a groundbreaking look at how countries around the world tackle the concept of deradicalization, something that seems like quite a pertinent topic given our turbulent current events cycle. This event was put together by Left Bank Books, and you can learn more about Power's book by going to their website at left-bank.com. Without any further delay, here's my conversation with Power. The other voice you're about to hear is Shane Mullen, who is Left Bank Books' event coordinator.
What are the roots of radicalism? Journalist Carla Power came to this question well before the January 6, 2021 attack in Washington, D.C. turned our country's attention to the problem of domestic radicalization. Her entry point was a different wave of radical panic, the way populists and pundits encouraged us to see the young people who joined ISIS and other terrorist organizations as simple monsters. Power wanted to chip away at the stereotypes by focusing not on what these young people had done, but why. What drew them into militancy? What visions of the world, of home, of land, of security for themselves and the people they loved shifted their thinking toward radical beliefs? And what visions of the world might bring them back to society. Power begins her journey by talking to the mothers of young men who joined ISIS in the UK and Canada. From there, she travels around the world in search of societies that are finding new and innovative ways to rehabilitate former extremists. We meet an American judge who has staked his career on finding new ways to handle terrorist suspects, a Pakistani woman running a game-changing school for former child soldiers, a radicalized Somali American who learns through literature to see beyond his Manichaean beliefs, and a former neo-Nazi who now helps disarm white supremacists. Along the way, Power gleans lessons that get her closer to answering the true question at the heart of her pursuit. Can we find a way to live together? An eye-opening, page-turning investigation, Homeland Security, speaks to the rise of division and radicalization in all forms, both at home and abroad. In this richly reported and deeply human account, Carla Power offers new ways to overcome the rising tides of extremism, one human at a time. Now about today's speakers. Carla Power is the author of If the Oceans Were Ink, a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. She began her journalistic career at Newsweek in the 1990s. Her reportage and essays have appeared in numerous publications, including Time, The New York Times, Foreign Policy, Vogue, Vanity Fair, and The Guardian. She now lives with her family in East Sussex, England, but is originally from St. Louis. Jason Rosenbaum is St. Louis Public Radio's political correspondent. Since becoming a professional journalist in 2006, Rosenbaum has extensively covered local, state, and federal politics for an array of publications, including the Columbia Daily Tribune, the St. Louis Beacon, and Missouri Lawyers Media. Rosenbaum has filed more than 35 feature stories for shows like Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Marketplace. And he's extensively reported on the aftermath of Michael Brown's shooting death in Ferguson and the fall of Eric Greitens from the Missouri governorship. Rosenbaum is an adjunct instructor at Washington University in St. Louis, where he teaches a class on radio news reporting and podcasting. He resides in Richmond Heights with his wife and 2 sons. And now, without further ado, if you would please help me in welcoming our guests for the evening, we have Carla Power and Jason Rosenbaum for Left Bank Books. Hello.
Hello. So nice to be here.
Very nice for you to be here. Like, I'm very excited. It's so great to welcome you back to the store. I know that we did an event with you for If the Oceans Were Ink when that book came out, and really happy to celebrate your book birthday today. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I am too. I mean, as I mentioned before, Left Bank is sort of my like bedrock bookstore, and I have spent many, many happy weekend hours there, not just browsing, but buying too, I hasten to add. So it's really, really nice to have the launch here.
Cute. All right, well, I will pass this over to you, Jason, and I will sit back and learn a lot.
Thank you, Shane. And thank you, Carla, for giving me the honor of interviewing you on your book's birthday. This is, as I told you before we pressed record, this is truly a phenomenal achievement in journalism. And you mention it in the book, but for the people that are watching, I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about what inspired you to write it and why the topic of de-radicalization was interesting to you.
Well, my first book had been about a conversation between me and someone who held very different beliefs from me, a very conservative, traditional Muslim scholar. And If the Oceans Were Ink was about sitting together and debating everything from gender politics to child marriage and trying to find common ground. And it was really exciting because we did find common ground. And that seemed to me to be a really worthy project to extend. But as long as I've been writing about Muslim societies, I haven't wanted to really face folks who had become involved in Islamist extremism or violent militancy. When people ask me, why do we hear so much about Islamist terrorism? I would sort of bat away the question and say, it's a tiny minority. It has nothing to do with Islam. And suddenly it occurred to me, it was relatively easy for me to find common ground with, a quietist, intellectual, bookish type. Those are the people I roll with anyway. But it occurred to me that if one really wanted to do a kind of listening campaign and to try to really understand people who hold very different beliefs from one, that I should investigate. I should sort of face what I had kind of been afraid of, which is to try to engage with people who joined jihadi groups and subsequently with white supremacist groups as well.
One of the fascinating dichotomies about this book is how it shines a light on the shortcomings of othering people, and especially othering people that join terrorist groups or want to join terrorist groups. And I think that one of the struggles that even you had in the book was you were watching some of these de-radicalization processes occur, especially in the United States, and you came away thinking almost that it was trying to instill mainstream American values in these people, and almost like this was almost a propagandistic campaign. Can you kind of elaborate on that? Because I found that struggle that you were even talking about in the book to be particularly fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of inner struggles in this book. Originally wanting to sort of chip away at the idea of Islamist exceptionalism. 20 years ago, we were all told that, Islamist terrorist was this great existential threat. They are trying to destroy our way of life. They are trying to destroy our civilization. And that was very much the framing of the event. And as I sort of kept talking to more and more people, it occurred to me that, when you dig down deeply, we've got to look for sort of the banality of evil in the Islamist terrorist. We have to, he or she is not often allowed that. We're not often allowed to look at the root causes and to see what might be very ordinary issues, or issues that are connected very much to wider societal trends, but that aren't this kind of giant block of threatening civilizational warfare when you look at it on an individual basis.
Yeah, because some of the people that you talked to, it wasn't just that they were, for example, joining ISIS because they were religious fanatics. It may have been something that was occurring in their personal lives, or they were alienated from their families that drove them to do things like that. And I want you to kind of elaborate on kind of like how social pressures or familial pressures sometimes drive people to extremism rather than sort of the general line that I think we've been fed, that, hardline Islam is turning all these people into ISIS fighters, basically.
Exactly. You put your finger on it. Whenever somebody says, oh, it's Islamist ideology that is driving these people, and they are religious fanatics, I think of the two guys who showed up in Syria having just bought copies of the Quran for Dummies, which is a very famous case. But some people, of course, and I think it's really important to kind of disaggregate this whole thing. Some people are, do come at it from an intellectual or ideological point of view. But the people I interviewed tended to have been victims in some way or groomed by recruiters who were very skilled in when it came to trying to lure people to the Islamic State, at figuring out what these people's needs or desires were, and trying to make the narrative of the Islamic State fit exactly what they needed. So the first guy I went to interview his mother, and he had been tremendously upset seeing images of Syrian children and wanted to go help Syrian children. And at the same time was also very upset over his parents' separation, and at sort of slightly Islamophobic treatment of his mother at her volunteer. She volunteered at a local school, and there was a big scandal, and he was under tremendous stress. And his mother says, "Look, I think the recruiters who got to him, they weren't pouring Quran verses into his ear necessarily. What they were doing was playing on his emotional frailty and selling him a line that he, everything would be better once he joined the glorious struggle over in Syria." And I came across this again and again, that there were really quite garden variety reasons for people initially going over. They can, embrace ideology later. And you talk to experts in radicalization, and they will say, you can get ideology at any point along your journey, but a lot of the individual causes are just as ordinary as trouble at home, or wanting a brotherhood, or wanting to do something more exciting than work at the local grocery store.
One of the reasons why I said on the outset that this was such an extraordinary work of journalism is you managed to talk with people that were directly affected or even participated in terrorist activity. And I'd like you to explain your processes for getting these people to talk with you, to open up with you, and whether you had to go through like 7 go-betweens to actually sit face to face with these people. As a journalist, I know you're not going to reveal like all your journalistic secrets to, thousands of people on the internet, but I would like to hear more about the process of actually talking with with primary sources for this book?
Well, it's really interesting because from an American perspective, yes, I probably would have had to go through, 6 or 7 go-betweens. But it's an indication of how relatively less securitized other countries are in their dealings. In that, for example, I went to Indonesia, where a guy who runs a local charity that helps former jihadis said, "Oh, come on over. I'm having a workshop conference with 4 generations of jihadis. It'll be great. I'll introduce you to all of them, and you can do interviews." So I got on a plane to Jakarta, and there in the hotel were 25 former militants, ranging from former mujahideen from Afghanistan to a family that had just come back from the Islamic State. And, according to the Indonesian government, they'd all done their time, returnees from the Islamic State at that point, and were treated sort of much more leniently than later they were. And it was absolutely, I would like to say it was a tremendous journalistic feat. And I hate to blow your illusions, but it really, it in terms of Indonesia, it wasn't that hard at all. A similar case in Denmark, in the town of Aarhus, where I went, where literally they have what I slightly glibly call the terrorist drop-off center, which is a little yellow house that was set up by the local police department, where former jihadis and people coming back from the Islamic State would literally drop by for coffee to talk to the detectives there, who, in their Hug a Terrorist program, as it's called by its critics, these detectives and policemen would help reintegrate them into Danish society. So helping them find jobs or psychologists or mentors or apartments. So in a lot of countries, there's a much less securitized environment in which to operate as a journalist.
Yeah, and that was the other striking thing about the book, about how certain countries allow or support de-radicalization programs. The Denmark example is a great one, compared to the United States, where you highlighted a nonprofit in Minneapolis that deals with Somali people that join terrorist groups. But it seemed like when it was supported by the government, it actually elicited a lot of skepticism and hostility amongst the community. And also, just from a political standpoint, as you say over and over in the book, the modus operandi of America, regardless of whether it's a Republican or Democratic president, has been, throw people in jail or kill them, not rehabilitate them. So can you talk a little bit about the differences between other countries' dealings with de-radicalization and what we've seen in America that seems like it's on a very small scale by comparison?
It's it's interesting. When I went to Muslim majority countries, I visited Pakistan and Indonesia for this book. And because there isn't that added layer of suspicion, of Islamophobia, basically, there is a sense, not that terrorists are, embraced, but there is a sense among society that these are young men who have just gone astray and have just have the wrong interpretation of Islam. And if somehow they can be coaxed back into the mainstream path, all will be well. And they also have really specialized in very, very grassroots programs. So literally, in Pakistan, I went and there's a program that trains village women in all sorts of things. And they don't wall off terrorism from voting rights or, hygiene or voting. And that they would train these women who were looking for extremists in their community. That this is at a time when the Taliban was marbled into this particular region of Pakistan. So these were brothers and cousins and fathers who were going off and joining the Taliban. And so this grassroots community training would have women, alerted to things like as mundane as, a bizarre amount of laundry hanging on a laundry line at a house that only has 4 people. And then suddenly there are 12 kurtas and cooking pots enough to cook for 50 guys. Or a sewing circle in one village where the women were sewing. The women, a militant had asked them to make bizarre jackets with a suspicious number of pockets. It turned out they were suicide bomber jackets. And a neighbor figured that out and was able to contact this NGO. And within a couple of months, they were able to wean the women away and give them other sewing projects that weren't so dangerous. So there's a sense in these two instances of militants being part of society, troubled parts of society. They may have to go to the jail. They may certainly have to be rehabilitated for a long time, but there's not a sense of them as the monsters that I think our popular discourse has made them.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the whole concept of othering for a second, and I think the maybe need for de-radicalization, especially in this country. So, and this is more of an anecdote that will eventually get to a question, so just bear with me for a second. Back in 2007, I was living in Columbia, Missouri, and there was this very high-profile parade of neo-Nazis there. And it turned out that there were only like 6 of these people and literally thousands of anti-neo-Nazi people that like booed and heckled these people. And I don't know if they threw objects at them, but it wouldn't surprise me. I think that there were some scuffles. And my mindset as an American Jew who may or may not have had family members die in the Holocaust, I'm not 100% sure of whether the Russians or the Germans killed them, or these people were clowns. They weren't people that were threatening. And I think I was able to compartmentalize these people as others, people that were just on the ultra fringes of society. But the more as time has gone on, I've realized that sort of mentality is dangerous because it's easy to look at people like that as kind of clownish, buffoonish figures. But the problem becomes when the ideology goes unchecked and spreads rapidly to the point where, and I'm using a different example from a book that I read, in Greece, there was a neo-Nazi party that actually won seats in parliament after being othered, like I just mentioned. So is that one of the reasons why it may be important to find some of people who hold white supremacist or, is a radical Islamic or whatever you want to call it, and try to steer them away from that before it reaches critical mass to where it actually could do real damage to domestic society?
You've said it beautifully. I do think, in a sense, dismissing them as clowns is not only dangerous, but it's its own form of flattening and othering. One of my pleas at the end of this book is we really have to figure out how, as Americans, to kind of regrow the connective tissues between us. And not allow these kind of mono identities, whether they're clowns or monsters, to take over. And that, again, it gets back to doing it at a local level. But I completely agree with you. I think, free speech and all that, pace free speech and all that, But there is a necessity for engagement rather than shutting them down or refusing to face them. In a strange way, I think extremists are kind of a map to the ills in society. And, this is not to condone them, but we need to find out why they feel the way they feel in an effort to stop it going further, or if after a terrorist attack, to prevent anything like that happening again. And I don't think that statistically, the methods that we have used, certainly overseas, have not worked. Deaths from terrorism escalated by like 9 times between 2000 and 2014. And, the countries we invaded or bombed, I think we invaded or bombed 7 countries during the War on Terror. And terror attacks there in those countries went up by 1,900%. And I should add that this is a stat that comes from the very conservative Cato Institute. So if I have a whiff of the bleeding heart liberal, fair enough. But I'm not alone in questioning what good these tactics have done.
And I was probably 18 years old when 9/11 happened, or maybe 17. I'm a journalist. I'm not great at math, by the way. And, the internet was around, and I think people were connecting with other people on the internet, but it was not nearly as all-encompassing as it is today. And I think when you look at what prompted people, for example, to storm the Capitol in January 6th of this year, a lot of it can be traced back to the people just absorbing, hours, if not days worth of pernicious falsehoods or conspiracy theories, whether it be QAnon, whether it be political figures talking about how the election was stolen when it really wasn't, are all sorts of other things that I think radicalize people. So I know that you began your reporting before January 6th, but it kind of goes back to my question before this about de-radicalizing people before things get really out of hand. Was January 6th a bright line example of why that's so important?
Absolutely. And I think, if you look at the people who were involved in January 6th, these weren't, teenagers or 21, these were older professional people, rather, downright middle-aged, which is ancient in terms of who joins extremist groups. I think a useful place to look at how sort of acceptable hatred has been dealt with is certainly Germany. And, I'm not the first to point this out. Susan Neiman's written a brilliant book about it. But I do think it's fascinating. I mean, after the war, basically, a huge chunk of the population had signed up to the Nazi cause, a third of all doctors. And, what do you do in a situation like that? And in truth, they, for a while, they sort of allowed a veil of forgetfulness to kind of fall over everybody except for the worst perpetrators. And there were attempts by the Allies to de-radicalize them. But you look at them now, and first of all, they decided to write into the Constitution anti-extremist measures. So they saw that, Hitler had come to power on, democratic elections. And so sewn into their Constitution is this idea of militant democracy, which is that some things last forever. And even if the popular vote wills it, you've got to guarantee basic human rights and separation of powers. So they set that up. And then when I went there, they've been really pretty muscular about setting up various rehabilitation programs, both for neo-Nazis and for Islamists. They have like 720 programs at least all over the country. And these range from, skateboarding, getting Nazis into skateboarding and trying to get them into punk rock, and they have all sorts of very German pedagogies that are designed for mentors to work with these kids and young people. There's something called subversive irritation theory, where you sit down and if someone says, "Oh, I want to take all the Muslims to camps," and you say, "Huh, how are you going to do that?" And they say, so you're going to take all these people to their death, and you try to anchor them to the very, very practical stances they have. And I would talk to the guys who were working with these neo-Nazis and said that, that often makes young people think again. But these are very well-funded programs. They're ridiculous years and years of mentors working with mentees, and it's a long, slow process, no matter how you approach it.
So a couple of questions related to current events before we throw it open to questions. Like, obviously, a lot of people are paying attention to what's going on in Afghanistan right now. I actually remember as a high schooler reading about the Taliban before 9/11 and comparing it to other Muslim majority countries like Indonesia or even Jordan and thinking, wow, this is a pretty out there sort of government. And I liked how in the fact that one of the things I liked about your book is you tried to make clear that like these flattening views of Islam and just thinking like every person who's Muslim or every Muslim country is just full of like anti-American extremism is really, stereotypical would be a kind word. But now we have a situation in Afghanistan where this fairly extremist government, which was chased out after 9/11, is now back. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts about the reinsertion of the Taliban into Afghanistan is going to affect de-radicalization efforts across the globe, so to speak.
Well, I think first off, that one of the sad things is it's not a reinsertion of the Taliban. They were there all the time. Talk about being marbled into the communities. I mean, they are. I always think it's really interesting that the press covers, there's the Taliban and then there are the Afghans. And it's like, no, actually, the Taliban are largely Afghan. I'm sure there are a few foreign fighters or Pakistanis certainly in there, but let's face it, they are grassroots. And I think, there's a great fear that it will become a perfect petri dish for various extremists, and it certainly has given. I have no doubt jihadis would be jihadis around the globe exhibit A in terms of a ragtag bunch of guerrillas who have defeated the most mighty army in the world. I would say, as a cautionary thing, that like everything else, it's important to disaggregate the Taliban. I was there with the photographer Nina Berman back in 1998 when the Taliban was it was definitely ruling in a very, very stringent way in Kabul. And yet even there, you'd go out into the countryside and meet a farmer and you'd be like, "Are you a Talib?" And he's like, "Sure. Yeah, I'm a Talib," in the sense of whichever the way the wind blows, yeah, I'm not gonna be stupid. I'm not, and so I think it was interesting. I was listening to Emil Simpson, who is a British Army officer who wrote a book, who led troops in Afghanistan, and he said our big mistake was in the battlefield was anybody who started shooting at us, we assumed they were Taliban. So suddenly, we couldn't distinguish, we couldn't disaggregate. And we had this notion of the Taliban as this corporate entity, whereas in fact, it's a shifting, ever re-networking and networking group. So it remains to be seen. I have to say that the news off the ground is incredibly depressing. It does seem as though the hardliners are going to win out, certainly in local areas. But we'll just have to wait and see. And I would defer to folks on the ground there.
And I wanted to ask about the concept of radicalization in terms of COVID-19, because I have seen a lot of people grasp to views on this virus that I would constitute as radical. Like, I have watched St. Louis County Council meetings where people stand in front on the lectern and say COVID-19 is not real. It's a Bill Gates, George Soros conspiracy. I've heard the whole, the vaccine has microchips in them. And these people, I feel, have been radicalized. And the problem is, these people could be our family members. And this is driving real interpersonal wedges within families across the country, much more so than whether this affects politics or not. I'd be interested in your take about whether this situation we are in now in COVID-19 is going to create a whole nother level of radicalization, and what can be done to, fuse these fissures that I just mentioned, that if they're not repaired could be really damaging to society.
I think you put your finger on it, definitely. I mean, the notion that radicalization is inherently a bad thing, I think we've got to lose, because it's the sap of change, it's the sap of newness. It's what was Thomas Paine if not a radical? That said, absolutely, I do think there have been a number of ways of radicalizations across the last few years, and certainly with COVID. I opened the book talking about how, with Trump's election, I felt radicalized. I literally did, in the sense that my willingness to understand other people's points of view was temporarily just halted. I think in times of crisis, people grab at certainties. They grab at fundamentalisms. And if we're not in crisis right now, I don't know what we are. So holding on to beliefs becomes like a safety blanket. And talking to people who might not can become a dialogue of the deaf. Again, I would cite what can be done. Well, on a very personal and at the Rosh Hashanah dinner table or at Thanksgiving, I would employ a technique called irritation theory, which the Germans talk about, and in fact, a lot of former extremists talk about, where there was just a scratch in their sense of reality, where, say, I'm thinking of a neo-Nazi who was hired by a Jewish furniture store owner, despite the fact that he had swastikas on his forearms. And that kind of put a dent in his worldview of Jews as all, rapacious and negative. And it started him thinking. And there are these tiny, if you can find a way to have a tiny crack in the other person's ideology, then that might lead to, but believe me, it is above my pay grade to figure out how we're going to get out of this mess, because between social media and the increasing isolation of all of us, thanks to COVID, where we're not going out and we're seeing fewer and fewer people and under much more controlled circumstances. That does not make for healthy civic discourse. It makes what was a brittle public sphere even more brittle. So I'm kind of batting this to my, to policy analysts, but I absolutely agree that COVID has brought a certain amount of radicalization.
We'll be right back after this quick break with Carla Power. Here's more of our conversation with Carla Power.
We have a couple of questions, and I have a couple of my own as well. But let's start with a question from Talia. Talia asks, what role does age play in a person's likelihood of becoming de-radicalized, or society's willingness to put in time and effort toward their radicalization? I.e., if someone is older, are they seen as a lost cause when it comes to de-radicalization?
That's a really, I think it varies from country to country. I do think that radicalization experts say over and over again that this is a young person's game, not only because of what your brain is doing when you're a teenager or a young person. You're most likely to take up a cause, or crash your mom's car, or whatever other vaguely antisocial activities you might engage in. A lot of formers simply age out. They get old, or if they actually make it to jihad, or if they make it into the inner circle of whatever extremist group they find, often the realities kind of and disillusionment with. There's one great story that the terrorism expert John Horgan tells about a member of an Italian leftist extremist group who saw that the leader of the group had incredibly dirty toenails. And he was like, this is not the kind of pure, shining knight in armor that I was expecting. When people, I do think that, it is younger people who tend to go into de-radicalization programs, partly because they're usually followers rather than leaders. And but it depends. I mean, you look to Germany and they will take folks, whatever age. And there's so many different levels and modes of de-radicalization programs that they can find a spot for them, whether it's disguising them and moving them to a new town, or sticking them in a punk band. So I think it really varies, but older people tend to age out.
Abigail is asking a question on Facebook, and it is, I'm going to read it off my phone because it cut off on the production. Thank you for a really fascinating discussion. Carla, it seems to me that one key thing you're saying is that the fundamental problem with current tactics against extremism is a lack of curiosity about the lives and minds of extremists. This intuitively strikes me as absolutely right, but it also reminds me that one way of defining extremism is a lack of curiosity or doubt. In your experiences of speaking to extremists, can you identify a moment or moments when you felt their curiosity or self-doubt was opened up, even in a very small way?
That's a great question. Absolutely. Well, I should say that nobody I talked to was still an active extremist. So everybody I had talked to had those moments of self-doubt that had taken them out of active service, as it were. I do think I think of one man I talked to in Indonesia who found that he had self-doubt when he was signed up at a restaurant, and he had to deal with people of all different kinds. this NGO that set him up decided that restaurant work was a way for former jihadis to really have to deal with people outside of their networks. And so here was a guy who had been trained to hate, all sorts of different kinds of people, Christians, Chinese people, and so on. And suddenly he had to serve them and bring them their beefsteak. And that to him was a crack in his ideology. Mixing people up was very much what I saw close up in Indonesia, where there was a kind of social engineering at this conference I went to, where there were the former jihadis were carefully mixed with entrepreneurs or academics, so that the idea was to steer them away from their jihadi kind of groups and into more mainstream society.
I want to get to Karen's question, but Talia's question has a follow-up question that kind of immediately talks about, or is a follow-up question before we change topics. Talia asks, can you recommend any resources about irritation theory? I'm interested in learning more about that and applying it to my QAnon believing extended family.
About what theory?
QAnon.
Sorry, what was
irritation theory?
Irritation theory. I got it. I got it by talking to German de-radicalizers, and I think that if you go, write me on my author page. I have a website, carlapower.com. And if you ask me, I have a couple of German English language resources that I'd be happy to share with you. And because there's lots of money in Germany for documenting this, and I'd be happy to share. Susan Neiman's book, Learning from the Germans, I don't think deals with de-radicalization per se, but she's really good on setting up the idea of how the Germans have dealt with their guilt and moving beyond it. So that might also be helpful. But I will wait for your email on irritation theory.
Karen is asking, really enjoyed the piece of your book that was in the Atlantic Monthly. How is the town in Belgium doing, and has the mayor's method of integrating the citizens of the town spread to other cities?
Bart Summers is a rock star now in terms of European de-radicalization approaches. He's definitely, according to him, all German police were supposed to read his book on how he de-radicalized Mechelen and so on. It's doing well, but when you read the book, you will see that there definitely are some issues. There was a slight rise in far-right extremism votes in the last election in 2019. It was less than surrounding towns, but it was still very much there. And on Facebook, you can see really, really vicious Trumpian hatred of migrants from the local extremist party. So it's not a fairy tale. But what I think I come back to again and again is how Bart saw the necessity of a new Europe and a new reality. And it wasn't just the migrants who had to adapt. It was folks like him who was sort of the equivalent of a Mayflower, immigrant. 17 generations of his family were living in Belgium. And he was like, look, we are all the first generation to live in a hyper multicultural Europe. And so it's not just, Abdul who's stepping off the boat from Syria, or Juan from Venezuela. We all are having to adjust to this new reality. And it's not about a place, it's about time and moving together in this time in which the world is globalized, and the idea that there's an out there does not exist. And he also, he's inspired people, I think, too, to think about the possibility for extremism within themselves, how absolutely ordinary it can be. And I think one of the reasons he was so good at doing it was that 2 generations ago in his family, when he saw all these ISIS volunteers running off from other towns around Belgium, he saw his great uncle who had run off to join the Nazis and was killed in a Nazi uniform. He's like, this is not a new civilizational threat. We've had this before. So,
Jennifer, hi there. Your high school friend Jennifer here. Hi,
Jennifer.
I have relatives who are Christian fundamentalists, and it seems impossible to get beyond their embedded beliefs that Jesus is telling them to not get the COVID vaccines because they are based on an aborted fetus from decades ago, and that Jesus is telling them Trump is the one saving Americans. How can one use irritation theory to put any hairline fracture when they believe this is all from the good of Jesus?
Well, I mean, I'm not a de-radicalizer, so I have not worked in rehabilitation. But I think, one rehab program I went to, the guy is like, look, we just keep talking and talking and talking. Like, do not cut it off. Just keep going, keep engaging. And someday, maybe you're going to find common ground. That's my 30-second spiel on that. And I absolutely believe that one of the problems is a lot of people have stopped engaging with people they don't agree with, and that is seen as absolutely okay. And it's okay in the short run, and it's certainly more comfortable. But I think in the medium and long term, it doesn't bode well for our, it's going to harden the arteries of it's already hardened the arteries of our democracy. And it, they're going to come to breaking point at a certain point.
That's it for now. You can learn more about Power's book by going to left-bank.com, and you can read all of our stories at stlpr.org. Politically Speaking is a product of St. Louis Public Radio, which is part of the University of Missouri-St. Louis. We'll be back next time. Thank you so much for listening.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.